So many of the companies we've been discussing over the last day or so are left to comply with a range of different national laws and regulations, or to just self-govern. And that means that we've had years of companies seeking to respond to the evolution of online harms and manipulation of the information environment. Our next panel will focus on how companies have approached these challenges over time and what it means for the broader policy debate. I'm delighted to turn now to Camille Francois, who I think will be showing up over here magically, who is the Chief Innovation Officer at Graphica and one of the leading scholars focused on disinformation globally. So with that, Camille, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I am here with a formidable panel of experts with Julie, with Wafa, and with Robyn to talk about what we've learned over the past few years on the industry's ability to self-regulate on the question of online harms. And if you would allow me to start there, I think, Robyn, it would be great to hear from you first, because I know that at Data and Society, you've been working on this question of how does the industry tackle content moderation on online harms, and you've really documented both the emergence and the professionalization of that field. What does it look like? Where are we now? Where did we start? And what does the world look like from a self-regulation of online harms perspective?
All right, so those are some big questions. We started working on this at Data and Society actually back in 2015. By that point, platforms have always had rules that they've used to govern their communities. Back in 2015, what we did, we had a project that we called Who Controls the Public Sphere in an Era of Algorithms, which is a very big name. And we were tasked with trying to figure out what happens, what are the major concerns as communication begins to centralize over platforms like social media and search. So at that time, what we did was we did around 10 case studies that looked at potential harms. So at the time it was looking at how Russia was, how Russia was interfering in what was going on in Ukraine, and the impact of platforms on media. And we brought together a group of academics to discuss these issues and to figure out, where the field should go if these were all major concerns. At the time, people really didn't think they were. And so we thought these were going to be concerns that were really going to be coming down the pipeline in the future, but were not major concerns now. Within that year, really everything changed. The issues that we were looking at exploded into the public's consciousness, and we began to see greater concern around online harms like mis and disinformation, specifically focused then on how people were disguising information as news, and as well as online hate. So we've really seen the issue emerge and change within the last couple of years pretty significantly.
Yeah, and I'm really grateful that your leadership at Data and Society started this project years ago, so that we have a little bit of a track record of what were the hot button issues of online harms. I think, Wafa, I'd love to hear from your perspective. You've been tracking these issues too for a very long time, and from different perspectives, working at Access Now and now at Omidyar, really being able to empower different research institutions and projects to look at all the different facets of online harms from a global perspective. Would love to hear from you on what do you think has emerged really as something that is now the sort of place where we need most attention, right? It feels like when we started this conversation, there was a lot of focus on a little bit of hate speech, a little bit of counterterrorism material that was sort of very top of mind and how these issues were discussed. And now we're finally sort of tackling different types of online harms that may be more difficult for platforms to address. How have you seen that evolve, and what does this look like from your perspective?
Thank you, Camille, for giving me the space. So I think, first of all, ultimately this issue is really, really big. When we talk about self-governance in the industry, I think even that conversation itself, as Robyn and Julie both will probably know, has shifted a lot in the past few years. And even the types of harms that we talk about are not the same that we've talked about years ago. When we talk about harms, we can talk about societal harms, economic harms. We can talk about harms to democratic norms. We can also talk about harms to individual users, such as shadow banning, the takedown of speech that is usually should be protected under international standards. Part of the problem is that I would say currently power is very concentrated in the private sector, specifically with big tech companies. And these tech companies are not accountable to anybody. And not only that, but they're understaffed, they're under-resourced insofar as, for instance, on issues of content moderation, listening to what actually impacts users and how their decisions influence and impact the world we know today. Part of the problem as well is that we see, that even when some companies do engage with civil society and academia, for instance, that type of engagement doesn't have any follow-up. It doesn't have any type of meaningful insight and engagement. And I think we need to see a lot more of that. Ultimately, I think, like I said, the problem is that these companies are very big decision makers, and they're unelected, they're unaccountable, and they don't really have a fair representation of the different sets of interests that should be around the table when it comes to societal issues. And they're also, the policies that they have are not the same from one platform to another, as we're all aware. And that obviously influences a lot more as well. And they're able to adjudicate what is allowed to say and what is not allowed to say. I think a lot of the problem centers around power, to be honest. And we need to take a closer look at that. Regulators need to be better educated about it as well. And more needs to be done to work with civil society as well as academic institutions. Of course, I'm sure we'll get into these in more detail later on in the panel as well, but right off the bat, I think that the concentration of power we need to be clear about the dilution of that.
Thank you, Wafa. That's very true, and we'll unpack a little bit how to wrap around this. Julie, if you are able to sort of close this round of framing remarks with both of your perspective, both of your hats, your Internet Sans Frontières hat and your hat as a member of the Facebook Oversight Board. I'd love to hear your thoughts on, again, where we are now, and specifically, what are the sort of new frontiers of how platforms do self-regulation now, engage in self-regulation, right? We heard Wafa on the need for more serious engagement with civil society, with academia. Is this the story of the Facebook Oversight Board? Is this the attempt to really regulate the self-regulation and have meaningful engagement with the community? What are you seeing from your vantage point?
Thank you, Camille. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I would say that the main role of the Facebook Oversight Board and why I chose to join is to make sure that freedom of expression is protected when content moderation are made by two powerful social media platforms, which are Facebook and Instagram. And on top of that, I would add that given the time in history in which we are, which Robyn and Wafa rightly detailed, it's, I would say, an interesting time to try things, a unique time in history to experiment with how the internet in general has completely disrupted our relationship between governing bodies and citizens. We've been having that conversation for long, and I think the Oversight Board is one of the results of this conversation. Is one interesting multi-stakeholder initiative. Why? Because first of all, the board was established, of course, by a company here, which is Facebook, but it was done so in a collaboration with organizations such as Internet Sans Frontières, for instance, and many others who have contributed to the text that govern this new body. And on top of that, in the practice of the board, we work with organizations, with users also, to whom we try to give as much voice as possible. Although, of course, 2 billion voices, it's difficult to have them all speaking at the time. But what we try to do in the cases that we take over and on the decisions, the binding decisions that we make that Facebook has to enforce, well, what we try to do is to take cases that are emblematic, symbolic, that could have a huge impact on the community standards, on the policies of the company, and for freedom of expression in general. And I would say even in the way we conduct business, the expression, we always try to foster conversations and dialogue, open conversations and dialogue, because I think this is what we need right now. We need more transparency, we need more openness, we need meaningful engagement, but meaningful means an engagement that ends up with results. And from my perspective, I am encouraged by the fact that all of the decisions that we've made have been respected by the company. For instance, when we've asked the company to reinstate content that the company had taken down, well, the company has done that. But even beyond that, the board is able to make recommendations based on its work with other stakeholders, including civil society organizations, based on the knowledge that the board members bring in, because we are a group of law professors, but also practitioners, civil society practitioners, digital rights advocates. And we bring in this knowledge to make recommendations that are responded to by the company on whether or not it's going to implement them. And I think that those open processes are an interesting experiment to which I chose to participate in, and I would say a quite encouraging one. And I'm happy to chat more about that later.
Are we correct in assuming that the oversight board is set up in such a way that right now, of course, it is Facebook's oversight board, but it could later down the line do the same function, perform the same function for other companies? Is that something that you sort of have in the long-term roadmap for the oversight board? Could it be the tech oversight board with other participants willing to follow these rules?
Right now, we're really modest. We really have a lot to do already when it comes to one of the platforms. I mean, two of them. But what is sure is what Wafa, I think, was saying, is that there is a need to open up that black box. I like that expression from our executive director, Thomas Hughes, at the board. We need to open that black box of content moderation. Why are the decisions made? Why are you taking this down? Why do you interpret this term this way and not in another? How did you come up with the policy? Who participated in that? And I think one of the examples of the emergency to have this discussion, not only in the US, not only in the EU, but everywhere else, including on the African continent. One of the examples is what is happening currently with Twitter in Nigeria. From my perspective, this is exactly the manifestation of this trend of politicizing. I'm trying to come up with a new term here. I'm not sure if I did well, but at least weaponizing, definitely, content moderation not being addressed properly, and lack of transparency. When there is no transparency, authoritarian regimes will harness that lack of transparency and would take advantage of it and say, Twitter and Facebook are dangerous for our societies. On the one hand, it can be true, it can be argued, but on the other hand, coming from governments that do not protect freedom of expression, it's quite problematic. And I think it's extremely important that we have these open conversations again on what is happening when it comes to content moderation, when it comes to censoring, especially now that we're censoring those same authoritarian regimes that have been dreaming to be able to come after those social media platforms.
Right. And I think here scholars around the world are quite grateful for the almost fact-finding aspect of what the board is doing, right? Like going and asking, not just what are the rules, but how did you come up with that rule? How is it actually being enforced? And what's happening post-enforcement, both in terms of transparency and in assessment, right? Like how are you assessing the both rules that you've crafted and how you're enforcing them? That leads me to a question that, Robyn, I'll turn to you for, which is, we are now having much more visibility onto why are these content moderation rules the way they are, right? Like what are their underlying principles? And I'd love to hear your take on do you think we're having a convergence moment where we have more of a cross-industry agreement on what are the core principles, maybe the Santa Clara principles, maybe the human rights principles that really hold these bodies of governance together? Or do you think that we are actually at a divergence moment where we see companies going their different ways? How are you thinking about that?
So we've seen this really shift throughout the years. And I really like Julie's framing of the black box, because that really indicates where this conversation has shifted. So very early on, when we spoke about the black box of technology, we were really referring to the technology itself. Over time, we started to also realize that these companies are black boxes for lots of different reasons, a lot of it having to do with kind of a widespread use of NDAs within the industry, a lot having to do with just complexity and pivoting. But there was just a growing understanding that what we needed to really know were how these companies were making these rules, and really how they were enforcing them too. So what we've seen basically their access to research really ebb and flow. So immediately after that period of time that I was referring to at the beginning of this panel, platforms really did start to open up a little bit more. They were allowing researchers in at least to do interviews. They were taking part of things like the Content Moderation at Scale conferences. And you started to see kind of this give and take between research and advocates and platforms, where research and advocates were really requesting and demanding certain things from platforms like transparency around the policies, takedowns, everything. We've seen that shift since then, and it's a little bit, so as platforms really have started to professionalize. They have started to reach out more to different stakeholder groups. We see this across platforms, across the industry, this just general practice of engagement. Quite similar to what is going on with the oversight board. There are these various boards that are at different levels of these companies, particularly used within things like trust and safety and content policies. So it's much more widespread than we really consider, or than we think, but I'm not certain it actually does add a significant amount of transparency within the industry. So the oversight board is significant in that we're really seeing a lot of decisions being made, and we're seeing the rationale for those decisions, and that's reaching the public. For much of this though, it introduces new forms of opacity. So how these platforms are engaging these different stakeholder groups, nobody knows who else they're engaging. Nobody knows how their opinions are being weighed in relation to other people, how they're being digested within the company, what other needs the company is considering in relation. So how are they considering it in relation to marketing, and how are their technologists engaging with this expertise given by different stakeholder groups. But it's a major challenge because these platforms are trying to do something very big. They're trying to scale content moderation at a scale that we can't really even fathom. And they're trying to also be responsive to concerns that they're not paying attention to local contexts and needs. So they're trying to do this middle ground through this engagement, which is a really interesting practice, but I do think that we need to see a significant amount more transparency there. They need to start letting researchers back in, because we've really started to see that decline as well.
I really like the framing that's emerging here from the discussions that we used to have on technology as a black box towards what you're describing as governance as a black box. Really, what underpins the decisions that you're making, how are they enforced, what are the consequences of that? And Robyn, I hear your case that actually we've lost some visibility and some independent access in how those, what's happening in this governance black box at the industry level. Wafa, I'd love to hear you on, what does that look like from your perspective? You've seen this as an advocate, as a funder, you've seen many groups try to solve these problems, and interrogate really how does this governance black box function, not just at the global level, but as Robyn said, in these different local contexts. Can you share a little bit more about what are today the hardest areas to get transparency on, right? What do we really not know on how those decisions are made? What are the hardest questions to ask for scholars and for civil society?
There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we don't know. And I would venture by starting to say that as a member of civil society, I mean, at the end, I'm a human rights lawyer, and I think we should demand more and we should exert more public pressure on the types of data that we request from these companies. So for instance, it's one thing to request takedown, the number of takedowns that have happened in a certain amount in a specific country. It's another thing to ask for how many times has your company met with governmental authorities in that country and for what purpose. It's time that as a society, we hold these tech companies accountable more. And on another note, I wanted to say that, I mean, I'm really thankful that people like Julie are on the external oversight board, because for years and years, she has been an advocate for human rights. And it's important that she's there. And I'm also grateful that you mentioned the fact that not all governments have a democratic system of governance. And that is a problem as well. It makes the problem even stickier. So whereas the external oversight board is one example of experimentation when it comes to governance, we have to continue to innovate in this space, whether it's through, because at the end of the day, look, even if you had perfect regulation, first of all, there are questions associated where that regulation comes from and from which countries and based on what standards. And of course, you have the political questions of national sovereignty, which to my own disappointment come up all the time when it comes to human rights. So there's a lot of issues we need to actually work through. But not only that, but as we get smarter about regulation, even if we have the perfect regulation, there's the regulators that give general guiding frameworks, like any type of legislation. It's not extremely specific, but then you have implementers, and those implementers need to continue to innovate on the private sector side to execute on these regulations. Eventually, when we do get to that wonderful day where we have good regulations that hold companies accountable, but they need to execute on them in a human rights respecting, healthy way. As we see today, I mean, a lot of the content moderation tasks, and I'm not even talking about other issues, but specifically content moderation, are outsourced to third parties. And oftentimes these consultants or staff, they're underpaid, they're under-resourced. There has been plenty of documentation about their working conditions, about the levels of trauma that they see every day without any type of recourse for their health. And I think, for instance, as civil society, one of the things that has come up lately is something called the Trust and Safety Professionals Association. Something like that is great. Why? Because it brings together different types of stakeholders, whether it's the vice president of a company or the implementer of a content moderation policy, together to actually, it's a conduit for a healthier conversation to really understand one another. And it's a meeting point for these various methods that we have and approaches in regulating the online space. I think, again, increased public pressure is necessary at this stage, especially because, for instance, unlike a normal type of governance that is democratic and transparent, there is no real type of recourse for wrongful decisions that have been made for tech companies. And once again, these representatives.
It's not to Julie, but yes, besides that.
Yeah, exactly. And I think generally speaking, I mean, these are individuals that are not elected. We do, as a society, we're unable to hold them accountable the way I hold a senator or representative accountable or a member of parliament. And that's vastly different. It's also very strange given the outsized and massive impact that the companies have on our everyday lives, including real politics. I mean, instead of having regulation, help guide how private companies work, we live in a reality where private companies decide the outcomes of public events. I mean, it's all upside down. So I think we definitely need to take a closer look and continue to innovate in that sense.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate your call to innovation in that space. And I think it goes to what Robyn was saying, that we're also seeing a professionalization of that field, right? I think the Trust and Safety Professional Association, the TSPA, is a great moment of indeed, let's actually convene the field and have trust and safety specific discussions, open up a little bit of that governance black box, make sure people can learn from one another, including smaller platforms able to perhaps skip some of the mistakes that have been made and documented. As you said, the other area in which there's been great progress thanks to scholarship, thanks to investigative journalism, is sort of illuminating the other side of the content moderation discussion, the enforcers, and sort of what happens to frontline content moderators. I'd love to hear the three of you on what is a good innovation in that space, right? Like, what are those small steps that we've seen small and or big companies do that you think are generally going in the right direction? I saw, for instance, Twitter announce a trust and safety fellowship, right? To have actually people join these trust and safety teams, Robyn, that goes to the points you were making about making sure that we don't lose this access that the community used to have. What are, again, some of those innovations that you've seen? And of course, the corollary to this question is, who's not making progress here? What are specific policies and or companies in which you're wondering, like, where is the innovation? Where are the answers to these questions? Where is the data? Why are you not, moving along with the rest of the field?
I'm happy to jump on this first. So in terms of innovation, something that I haven't really seen, being widespread yet, but I hope that's going to change, and I'm definitely working on that, is making sure that in addition to the various engagement that exists between company policy teams and organizations, civil society organizations particularly, on top of that, adding also interactions with product and design teams. I think they are, from my perspective, they are demanding of that. Not, I call it the Mount Olympus. They're kept up there and doing their thing. We don't really get to interact with them. But I think it would be beneficial for these professionals to be, close to the communities that are affected by their tools, and that are badly affected mostly, because, like we know, the communities, the vulnerable communities, or at least the minority communities, are the first one to bear the brunt of what goes wrong, what could potentially go wrong with those services and tools. So it's a field that I'm particularly interested in at the moment. And yes, it would even serve as good inspiration for regulators, for governments who want to regulate. Because what we see right now, as Wafa pointed out rightly, is our regulations that are, first of all, not even applicable. We cannot apply them. It's difficult to implement them at scale, especially. Or we have, even when they're implemented, we have zealous enforcement to avoid fines. And that's a recognition from the industry, from the private industry on that. So I think having more meaningful engagement, also involving product and design teams, to make sure that the recommendations that we make did not remain only recommendations, policy recommendations, but actually transform into the tools that are delivered to the users and to the communities.
Angela, that highlights sort of the importance of, as the three of you highlighted, opening up that governance black box in order to have more meaningful, including regulatory framework, right? In order to have regulations that actually make sense given how decisions are made, how they're implemented, and how they shape people's lives on the ground. Wafa, I'm curious to hear your both on again, those innovations that you think are going in the right way, and those areas and or players and or rules on which you're saying, why are we not seeing any movement there?
Would you like me to jump in first?
Let's do it.
So the best innovation that I've seen recently is Twitter opening up their verification process to public comment. That was super interesting. Most of what I'm looking into right now is I'm tracking how platforms are using that tool of verification that they've had for a really long time to address some of these issues. And that was one really interesting development, that they decided to open it up to their users and have them comment on the policy before they launched it. So that was it was incredible, and I'd like to see that happen a lot more. I agree with Julie. What we continue to not see are platforms really engaging with the communities that they're impacting before they launch a product. Some researchers at Data and Society just released a report called The Unseen Teen. And as part of that, they did a lot of interviews with product people at platforms. And years later, after we've kind of, after 6 years later from that initial workshop the Data and Society did, and 5 years after a lot of these issues really blew up, they found that platforms are continuing to not actually interact with these user communities. So that was very upsetting. And it showed me that they're not really learning from a lot of the criticism that they're getting in this space. I think across the board, we need to see more transparency from those big industrial content moderation platforms, so the platforms that use industrial content moderation, about how they're using these third-party services. We have so little understanding about how enforcement happens still. Thankfully, thankfully, because of work like Sarah Roberts has done and Adrian Chen, we have little bits, but we should have a lot more information about what is going on there, what services they're using, how many people they're employing, where those people are located, what content they're reviewing depending on where they're located. Like we really don't have a lot of information, and we need to see more.
Yeah, that's a really good call out. Wafa, what does that look like from your perspective?
I mean, first of all, we see platforms doing more, but they should still do a lot more. But we've seen them do more, as evidenced by, for instance, the recent US elections, which actually, you look at, for instance, Facebook's focus on elections started with maybe the ad library and the disclosure of how much each candidate is spending on political advertising on their different Facebook pages. Unfortunately, they didn't apply that. They didn't provide that type of ad library globally. It was only 5 countries to start, and then it was slowly unfolding. I still don't know actually if it's applied globally or not, but we also see Twitter putting labels on different tweets at the beginning, and then eventually they suggested to users that they read articles before they retweet them. So it echoes kind of what Julia was saying about not all of the changes are policy oriented necessarily. They're also design changes. They're also infrastructural changes. And this also applies to private messaging, for instance, not just public type of postings and sharing. WhatsApp has limited the number of forwards that users can engage in, and that we hear from them has reduced the number of misinformation, the amount of misinformation being spread, but we don't know that for sure, of course, which again leads me to a recommendation that I made earlier, that more should be shared with academics and researchers and civil society advocates to actually verify what the companies are saying vis-a-vis misinformation, harms to children, takedowns that are unlawful in specific contexts. And so we need to innovate in that way as well. I would say, if I had, because I know we're slowly running out of time, but if I had like a few recommendations just to recommend to companies, and of course, each stakeholder, each equity does have a role to play in this conversation. Though if you look at companies specifically, first of all, they should engage with civil society more meaningfully, as we've discussed in this conversation. They need to provide better support to content moderation implementers and executors and the implementers of policies. They need to better explain their policies, including privacy policies, to their users. And finally, more anonymized data should be shared with how the information flows and market sizes, as well as trends on sharing posts or how many users are created when it comes to a specific political event. Or there's a variety of different data points that we have no idea about. And by sharing them, these companies will not, I mean, I say this with the caveat that no personal information should be revealed, but there is data out there that can be shared with the public at large and regulators that does not compromise user data and user privacy. It's important to say that, because oftentimes we see the excuse, the justification that we don't want to share the private information about our users. That's not what we're asking for. We're asking for more anonymized macro data, if you will, to help us keep these companies accountable under the regular rule of law in democratic contexts.
Yeah, and that's really important. I think there is indeed miles to go on how much can be shared to restore what Robyn was saying, which is a sense of access and accountability by scholars, by advocates, by civil society, to ensure that there is actually some visibility into what's happening there. Robyn, I've learned from your work, if you don't mind putting on you on the spot here, that we tend to consider the trust and safety we feel in that community sort of in our own context. And I think a lot of us, coming from the human rights perspective, but I've heard, from you too, that there's also other forces that are joining this debate from their own vantage point and shaping it from their own perspectives. For instance, a lot in the ad tech industry also has their own content moderation set of issues, guidelines, set of governance principles. And similarly, oddly enough, the influencers on multiple platforms are also starting to organize and ask questions about how are those rules being crafted and how do they impact what they do online. How should we think about these sort of edges of the field of the content moderation, new communities asking these questions, and perhaps areas similar to the one that you talked about in the enforcers, of like areas that do engage with these questions on which we have little visibility, like the beautiful, messy bananas world of ad tech?
Oh, so it's a big question. Ad tech is a crazy beast that we really haven't addressed enough in this debate. Part of that is because it's very opaque. It's just much more difficult to get access to, and it's you're right. So platforms have one set of rules and advertisers have another set of rules. What we're seeing right now is that those two are interacting more. So because of programmatic advertising, so programmatic advertising is the dominant form of advertising on the online. Advertisers can't always control where their ads will land. And so what we're really seeing is platforms trying to make their sites more predictable and kind of safe for advertisers. And that means that advertisers are having like a pretty outsized role in setting content rules online. We see that most on YouTube. So YouTube, there was a big phenomenon on YouTube over the last couple of years, referred to by the community as demonetization. And what we saw was this kind of like ongoing debate and set of tensions around, these two different competing visions of what the internet should be. So should it be a space for participatory culture, for as many people to be able to contribute to the public sphere as possible? Or should it be a space where we can access reliable, good information all the time? Sometimes those don't always coexist very well. So with the demonetization debate, we really saw some of those contours really start to be drawn by companies. And what ended up happening with that one is that what YouTube did as a platform was that they basically just took huge portions of online content and said, we are going to demonetize if your video has anything to do with these. So if your video touches on political content, any controversial subject, of course, profanity, nudity. And it was a very interesting experiment for what the internet might end up looking like. And in that, users found huge swaths of their content demonetized. And what they ended up really complaining about to platforms was that platforms had one set of rules for them, and then they had a different set of rules for legacy media that they were allowing to kind of manage their own ad relationships. So that's what we're seeing with the influence of advertising. We're seeing platforms try to create kind of safer, more predictable spaces online. That's impacting the kind of content that people are able to create or able to monetize. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but we are starting to see these tensions emerge in these online spaces as they think that there is like one set of rules for one set of actors and another set of rules for them.
And that really, is a case study that illustrates the point that Wafa was making about all of this being, power relationships that are brokered between different entities that we don't necessarily have visibility into. And that's not just about the rules and what's up and what's down. It's about the myriads of different ways they're enforced and the design decisions that flow from this. I want to make a little bit of room for an audience question, which I know will be very close to your heart and something that both Wafa specifically and Julie, you've worked a lot on. It is, would having tech platforms embrace international human rights standards as their North Star suggest a path forward in fighting online harms? Wafa, let's start with you. I know this is something you've been advocating for a long time. How are we doing with that? And where is it helpful? Where is it not?
The direct question is yes, it would be great if they use it as their North Star. That being said, there's a variety of different formulations, modalities that you could take human rights law as your North Star. So for instance, when we see human rights impact assessments, oftentimes they're done and dusted, once and done, and they forget about them. They never look at them again. I would advocate for a more rolling basis of human rights assessments, a more regular check-in on how their policies are corresponding to and complying with international human rights regulations. The big benefit in that, and I'll be brief, is that states have already agreed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There isn't the question of national sovereignty or any type of political considerations when it comes to that, especially because there's such a big mishmash of regulations and types of governance systems around the world that states have. And so that is a high standard. As somebody who continues to work on that and work in that field, that field should also be improved to mirror the virtual space as well as much as possible. So yes.
Yeah, thank you. It was a really important consideration in making sure that the human rights standards are not just a paint, coat of paint, but really a process that continues to shape and frame the way these content moderation debates are unfolding. Julie, what does this look like from all the work that you've been able to do at the oversight board to kind of open up this governance black box and see where we can use the international human rights principles as an anchor for these questions?
Well, I would say that international human rights law and standards are the basis on which, one of the bases on which the board makes its decisions. It's in our bylaws, and we have tried. I mean, we're really in an uncharted territory here. What does freedom of expression actually look like online, mean online, when you try to apply it concretely? What does privacy mean online? There's been a lot of literature on that, but not any attempt to, force platform, encourage them to give a life to it on their platforms in a more concrete way. What does the right to live? What does the right to safety? Does that exist? I mean, these are all questions that we ask ourselves. And most importantly, we're asking ourselves whether or not the content moderation decision made by Facebook and Instagram are compliant with those standards and law. And also, I think that there will be increasingly more conversations on whether or not the community standards themselves, which are put forward as the law applied by the platforms themselves, whether these are even compliant with those rights and standards that we're talking about. So yes, I definitely am in favor and encourage personally, but also as a board member, encourage increasingly platforms to rely on this set of norms and regulations, because yes, it's a unique time in history again when governments could sit down together and agree on a set of values and principles that they think democratic societies should adhere to. And it's even more important, I apologize, as we are in a time where authoritarianism is rising. And when that happens in history, everybody has to play a role, and specifically those who have now new powers to protect democracy and democratic principles. So I would definitely encourage private companies that have a huge impact on our societies and particularly on our democracies to play that role, to step into that role to protect and safeguard democracy and human rights, like civil society organizations have always done. So yes, I would say we should continue doing that.
So a strong yes, and let's continue on this path. It is more important than ever to actually have those self-governance principles and mechanisms be strongly anchored against the international human rights principles. Thank you, Julie, for that. And Wafa, you've given us 3 things you wanted in that space. Julie, you've given us one big ask. Robyn, let's close this discussion with you. What's a thing you want? It doesn't have to be the biggest thing, but what's a thing that would actually, for your perspective, make a meaningful difference for accountability and transparency in this self-governance space?
Camille, I'm a researcher, so you know I'm going to say more access to researchers. It's a very self-interested response to that, but I do think it would be very helpful for platforms to open themselves up a little bit more again, let more researchers in, not just give access to more data, but allow them to do some meaningful qualitative research as well on how they make decisions.
Yeah, and I think that we've seen over the years how much this actually does make an impact, and you've made a clear case that this is not trending in the right direction. So it's a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Wafa. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Robyn. We're so grateful for all your contributions in that space. And I think with this, I will throw it back to Graham. Thank you so much for joining this discussion today.